Hello, folks. For this week's session of our Open Door Tuesdays, I thought it would be helpful to respond to a question that came last week, and that was about how we achieve our ideal of nurturing each child's purpose. So we've got this framework which I shared of a five-fold map of how we conceive of ourselves: being alive to the moment in a non-violent way, being flexible in Kairos time, not Chronos time, being able to improve our ability to see children objectively, each individual child fully and holistically, then nurturing each child's purpose and helping them, first of all, discover their strength, their talent, their element, and how do we help mentor them into further success and skill. How do we challenge themselves, not just in their strength, but all aspects of themselves, strengths and weaknesses for themselves, and also areas of neglect that the school system tends to neglect in terms of commonplace conventional schooling systems that tends to neglect areas of non-academic practice. Then is also the idea of seeing the whole school as a system, as an adapting system, as in a sense that it learns and responds to its environment, responds creatively, bringing in stakeholders like the parents and external pressures of the government and the economy and artificial intelligence now popping up, and various pressures outside the schools as well as within our school of how do we respond and perceive our practice as part of a system. So here there was a question of how do we do this one, and I'd like to respond to that. I think that would be most appropriate for this week. So I'm going to try to be brief, so hopefully it will be able to provoke further questions in future. One of the main aspects is the skills of mentorship. And to be a good mentor, a worthy mentor, first of all, is to be a worthy role model for children, our mentees, and to be able to follow certain guidelines around mentorship. And part of my previous life was to work in a mentoring organization called Boys to Men, serving teenage boys specifically, which advises one not to frap. There we are. Sorry, maybe I should have done this in typing. And rather to learn. So there's a tendency for adults to slip into these habits, which are natural and motivated by care and love, but in fact they tend to interfere with a healthy mentoring relationship. And the acronym of FRAP is to try to fix a child's problem, to try rescue the child from his or her problem, to try give advice of trying to it's a form of rescuing, to try and solve the problem for the child, and to project my own past or my own beliefs as an adult with the arrogance of assuming I know the answer onto the child. And I hasten to add that this comes from a mentoring organization which is outside the family and the school. So in some sense, there's a legitimate need, nevertheless, to offer advice, because advice is still needed. But sometimes the advice is known to the child, and when that's the case, which is often the case, then advice can be unhelpful. So to fix the problem, to rescue the child from the problem, to give advice, to give unwanted advice, I should say, and to project my own experience, my own past, my own wounds, my own beliefs onto the child. is usually unhelpful. And instead, the advice is to listen and love the child, to accept, to be completely accept the child for with whatever that he or she does and brings, to model what the good behavior that we expect, to be the role model. If we're asking for something, we should be modeling that same behavior. And this idea of offering a blessing, not in a religious sense, but to be able to admire and appreciate and value the child's qualities specifically, so they feel seen. And you'll notice this is very much part of our birthday blessings and Kairos. So these ideas of mentorship are, I think, helpful and often a way of helping a child feel seen. And when they feel seen, they feel able to bring themselves fully into the mentoring relationship, and in our case, into the school community and the class community, and in relationship with their teachers. And an aspect of this is non-violent communication, and that will need to be a whole session in itself, or a series of sessions. And generally, there are various guidelines here that sometimes when we speak to anyone, including the children in our care, we can be speaking in a way that is violent or is devoid of compassion. Sometimes we impose our will in various ways on other people. And when we do that, there's the idea from Marshall Rosenberg that we are being unempathic or violent. And I'll leave that for a separate session. In general, in the teaching relationship, now moving on to a separate point, there is the idea that we need to balance the educational obligations of teachers who are guiding a child into acquiring curriculum objectives that are required by their society. And part of those objectives are required soon because they're soon heading into other schools. High schools are expecting certain skills that are sometimes arbitrary, and the skill of writing a multiple choice test or a certain kind of exam are often quite arbitrary and not particularly valuable for their future life. But nevertheless, they are important in terms of their own lives coming up. And in general, in our school, our children are heading into a conventional high school context. And our teachers are pressed to help the children prepare for readiness into those expectations. And they're quite specific and comprehensive. At the same time, there are wants from the child and sometimes legitimate needs for their own sense of wanting a sense of their voice, to be able to sometimes do certain things that they are passionate about within the lessons. And there's a balancing act between helping a child learn what needs to be learned from external pressures, not merely the game of school, but also for future life, that certain aspects of literacy and thinking skills are part of mainstream conventional schooling. Maths is a valuable tool to structure a child's strength and skill in learning to think logically. And sometimes that's arbitrary because children learn to be able to learn maths by rote, but often good maths teaching does help a child learn to think logically. It's a valuable tool that is, despite the weaknesses of teachers, children do pick up skills of logical thinking. And therefore, maths has remained a tool within schooling. But that skill can also extend in the skills in the conventional schooling system, also extend to writing essays and thinking clearly and being able to articulate oneself in writing on the page. and also be able to present art, imagery artistically and creatively, and to be creative and to work with others collaboratively, and to be able to cooperate with one's classmates. And the community of the class are very valuable skills. Sometimes that are pressed from the conventional system, and sometimes are a legitimate need from the child, him or herself. And when the child is asking for this themselves, sometimes there's a needs to be a negotiation between what the child wants and sometimes legitimately needs from an educational point of view, and sometimes needs to be defer that and find time to do that at other times while the curriculum is also being taught. So that there's a negotiation, a balancing act, a compromise between what the child wants and needs and what the teacher is feeling the need, and what the teacher feels it is important to learn. Sometimes there are weaknesses in both. Sometimes a teacher is able to be convinced by the child's wishes, and sometimes the child is able to be convinced by the teacher. And the negotiation is a valuable, healthy one. The conversation to reach a meeting point is an important one, so that the voice of the child is not suppressed, but the child nevertheless doesn't reject the teacher's guidance and educational function. Because if it goes too far to either extreme, that the teacher gains too much authority or the child gains too much freedom, there's going to be weakness in the educational process. And there's certain tools that guide us in this sense. One is that we work in integrated studies so that we're not going arbitrarily from lesson to lesson. So that although we do have a timetable that does have lesson to lesson, we do have also this feeling of a theme, and also feeling of a theme lesson, a long lesson that's much longer than a typical conventional school. And this theme lesson lasts approximately a month and sometimes longer for the younger grades, because that theme helps a child go deeper into a particular area of exploration and become interested more naturally, because the depth achieves its own interest. And also because of the month-long theme of these long lessons, the child has more space, children in the class have more space to offer their own wishes and preferences and choice. And also the integrated studies can introduce English skills while teaching science. And while doing that, there's some illustration of the text. So there's some art going on integrated with English practice, which is also integrated with science. For an example, in a theme that would be a scientific one. In a scientific theme that will still nevertheless be an English practice and an art practice in the scientific investigation. And then there's a change of the theme into something completely different. From a science often moves to something in the humanities, so that there's a change of energy and atmosphere and content, and there's this balancing rhythm that moves through different themes, so that we ensure we are covering the mainstream curriculum in ways that are designed to retain interest and motivation and engagement, emotional engagement for the children. And then there are also the guidelines from Rudolf Steiner, which are very valuable in the content of these themes, because Steiner had an extremely valuable insight that children move through different ages. As the child moves through different ages, their psychology changes, and there's a way of, if one analyzes that psychology, the age comes with different interests, and therefore different kind of academic content changes from year to year, and therefore different kind of stories and different kind of educational content is more appropriate for these different ages. And these guidelines are really valuable because we can bring educational content that is mapped against a conventional curriculum in a way that meets the child's interests as a general sense of guideline from the group of children that is in front of each teacher. And at the same time, there's the guideline to have this idea that we have of child's sight, of seeing each individual completely objectively and as objectively as we can, so that we get to know each individual. And because there's differences between the individuals, we can adapt the content so that we cater for the differences in our class. So there are general differences from that we receive from the Steiner's guidance of a typical age has a likely to have a particular interest that is generally ignored by the conventional curriculum of CAPS and IEV and other curriculum guidelines. And I can go into detail on these guidelines at a different time. And so that's from age to age, differences between different ages, and then differences between children. Sometimes there are just different temperaments between the children, and sometimes different personality types, which are two separate points. And individually, some child has a particular interest that it is, because we are a small school, there are ways to adapt our content that takes into account the various individuals in the class. And lastly, there's a general point. I suppose, firstly, there's the idea that we try and make the learning as experiential as possible, to introduce projects as much as possible, and to introduce activities that are not simply sitting at a desk, but moving around, and musical and physical, and integrated across the various intelligences of a human being. So that's important, that we're not responding to a child merely as an intellect, but as a whole person. And then there's the idea that we are improving our abilities as teachers, as educators, and we're aspiring for mastery in the educational arts, that we see the teacher as an artist, and the learning that happens in the classroom is their canvas. And we aspire to be aiming for mastery in these arts. And there are various guidelines from various modalities, Steiner being one of them. There are various valuable skills like storytelling and classroom management, which are deeply insightful from the Steiner's guidelines and his schools that he helped create or mentored their creation. And there's various other inspirational teachers from around the world, and there are many, and we can go through various ideas coming from around the world that are valuable and interesting. And we are interested in many of these ideas that we integrate and utilize within Kairos. I hope that answers Anna's question about how do we respond to the individual's purpose. We guide and mentor. We try to be able to negotiate between the child's wishes and needs and the curriculum pressures of the society. We try and bring this integrated studies feeling, that they're not in an ADHD mode of moving from lesson to lesson, but are in these long journeys of learning through a theme that goes deeply and allows for personal investigations and detours in the class, because there's time to do these lessons that more or less are about a little longer than an hour and a half each day, that lasts a month long, these themes. And there's these guidelines from Steiner to guide us in content from year to year. And there's the idea that we try and see the differences between children in the class. And we try and bring learning experiences that are experiential as much as possible. And the general aspiration that we are yearning as teachers to achieve mastery in the educational arts. And we are the artists of a canvas, which is the learning that happens in the classroom. Sometimes for the teacher, but also as much as possible for the children and the class community. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you very much. And well, I'm going to leave that there, and comments are welcome.